Right. Could we start really by trying to thrash out really this whole question of whether or not there was the climate for the growth of liberation theology in any part of Ireland, because usually it's associated with Latin America because of political conditions, particularly oppression, colonialism, poverty. Now, you could argue some of those conditions were familiar in Irish history. So was there a tradition of radical Catholicism in Ireland to address political problems?
I'm not so sure that it's true to say that there was that as a tradition per se. Certainly in the 19th century, we do know of a number of attempts at revolution and the Church's response to those attempts. And of course, as is well known, we always say that the Church will never support a revolution until it's successful. So that the Church's position tends to be supportive of the state as it is, however constituted. And that is a sort of very much the backbone, if you like, of Catholic attitudes to these matters. So you could say that when, in fact, liberation theology comes along in the 1960s, that this is a kind of a departure, shall we say, from received Catholic tradition, which has tended always to support the state, even in circumstances where the state has been highly oppressive. And obviously in the 1920s and 1930s, the Church did give support to fascism in Italy and in Germany. Despite the kind of the evil of fascism, it nevertheless does have support from the Church. And that is how Catholicism has functioned. Now, it is true that there is another strand, and that is a strand beginning with Augustine, taken up with by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, that in certain circumstances, it might be possible for people to rise up in a revolution, if you like, Aquinas wouldn't quite put it in those terms, and overturn their political masters. But there are very strict conditions under which that can happen from the point of view of Catholic moral theology. And so obviously the question is, and it was a question that was faced, as I say, also in the 19th century, in the early years of the 20th century in Ireland with the 1916 Rising and so on, are those conditions, was Ireland a place in which those conditions were fulfilled? Because for a revolution to be kind of legitimate from the point of view of Catholic theology, one basic point is that there cannot be other means of attaining the end that you want. So in other words, if you want a just, free society, you cannot resort to violence to achieve that if there are alternatives. And clearly, whether you liked it or not, Northern Ireland was a democratic society, a very imperfect example, shall we say, of a democratic society, because as we know from the history of the setting up of the state, it was set up in such a way as to ensure that effectively one political party and one religion would dominate. So that you could say, well, the very foundations of the state made it so unjust that a resort to violence was possibly, from the point of view of Catholic theology, acceptable and permissible. This is not, however, the view that the Catholic Church took since the foundation of the state in 1921. The object and the aim, if you like, was to participate in the state and in the structures of the state. Although, having said that, there is also a sense in which you could say that the functioning and the activities of Catholicism since 1921 in the context of Northern Ireland was to create a state within a state. So in other words, that the Church evolved its own education system, its own health system. Catholics, tended to stick together. They lived separately, and so on and so forth. So that you have the creation of, as I say, a state within a state, controlled and manipulated to some extent by the Church. So I don't think it would be accurate to say that there was a kind of a tradition of the theology of liberation, or that took hold particularly in the context of the Troubles from 1969 onwards.
If we go further back than that, because you've talked about in some of the stuff that you've written, that Catholic Ireland, as we're looking at the 19th century here, was not simply the passive victim of poverty and squalor, but that it had a growing sense of Catholic power aligned with a desire for political change and a reconfiguration of social circumstances. So just that background, just that sense of itself as a Catholic country, just that sense of the role it could play. Does that, because in a way, aren't we really also looking at any sort of political theology? So that it didn't necessarily have to be liberation theology with a revolutionary edge, but some sort of political Catholic theology that could have given us a different outcome.
Well, I think there are two things to be said. There was the desire on the part of institutional Catholicism simply to control Ireland in the 19th century in all its aspects. On the other hand, as we know, beginning with, I suppose, Daniel O'Connell makes clear that, of course, Catholicism is important. It's important for Irish identity and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the political leaders cannot be dictated to by the church. So O'Connell evolves this idea that whilst we take our religion from Rome, our politics are from home. And he resisted the blandishments, as it were, of bishops, although he still needed them to attain his aims, particularly in Catholic emancipation, and then secondly, with the whole campaign for the repeal of the Union. He needed the church, he needed institutional Catholicism, he needed its power, he needed the fact that priests were the people on the ground who had most contact with people, with ordinary people. And so he uses the clergy, the ordinary priests, to propagate his views, either in terms of Catholic emancipation on the one hand or the repeal of the Union on the other. And yet, he doesn't want the bishops to have too much power, because he doesn't want to be dictated to by bishops, by the institutional church. On the other hand, when O'Connell dies and so on, and you have a more kind of a revival of a more radical approach, shall we say, to Irish politics, first of all in the shape of Young Ireland, first of all, and then the Fenians subsequently, you do get kind of a change of ideology on the part of bishops, and in particular on the part of Cullen, Archbishop Cullen, who becomes Cardinal Cullen subsequently. His desire was to create an Ireland in which Catholic lay people would take their rightful place. The church was obsessed with the fact that Ireland was still dominated by Protestants in the 19th century, despite Catholic emancipation. Most of the government posts were held by Protestants. Most of the structure of the state were controlled by Protestants, and this is something they simply didn't want. They wanted judges, MPs, justices of the peace, and so on, to have all of these positions filled by Catholics. Because, of course, the result of this would be it would give more power and more prestige to the church in its institutional aspect. And this is very, very clearly the agenda for Cullen when he arrives back in Ireland in 1850 from Rome to become, first of all, Archbishop of Armagh and then Archbishop of Dublin. This is very much his view of what Ireland should be, an Ireland that is, insofar as it can be, controlled by Catholics, Catholic lay people, who in turn are subservient to and obedient to the institutional church. This was his model of church-state relations. And of course this is disrupted for all sorts of reasons. Partly because some of the most important leaders in Irish politics in the 19th century were Protestant, Parnell, or on the other hand, because of this kind of revolutionary tradition which continued to obtain. And after all, by the 1860s, there were about 79,000 Fenians in the country. Very substantial pro-revolutionary group, shall we say. But such was the sensitivity of the church to this strand of revolutionary activities that, in fact, in 1870, the Irish church appealed to Pope Pius IX to condemn Fenianism by name. And it's what he did in January of 1870. And making it clear that you cannot be a Catholic and a member of the Fenian organisation. And it seems extraordinary that the Church in Ireland would go to that length to get the Pope to do this, to condemn the Fenians. It just seems absolutely extraordinary. But of course, as so often happens, people simply ignored what Pius IX had to say and continued to be Fenians. The difficulty from the specific kind of religious point of view was this. Cullen made it a regulation that Fenians could not receive the sacraments in the Diocese of Dublin. And whilst the Church was quite happy to administer the sacraments to soldiers, to police, to all of the structures of the state and those who uphold them and operated them, it would not permit Fenians to receive the sacraments, at least in the Diocese of Dublin. The Fenians got round this in various ways. This might seem strange, given the conservatism of the Jesuit order, but they went to the Jesuit church in Dublin to make their confessions and receive Holy Communion. Why? Because the Jesuits were an exempt, as were religious order, and therefore not under the control of the Archbishop of Dublin, Cardinal Cullen, who had made this regulation. So there are ways around it.
What is it about Fenianism that they find so objectionable? Either one of you.
I've talked enough at this stage.
Oh, I'm just thinking there that my grandfather on my father's side, the family folklore is that he was a Fenian. And he lived to be 102, so it didn't do him any harm. And certainly any kind of papal denunciation wouldn't have done him any harm either. But we always reckoned that there were at least three kinds of Fenians. One would be a militant Fenian, and the other would be a Fenian supporter and subscriber, both in the sense of joining up to something or giving money or whatever. And the other was a kind of market day Fenian who would buy the ballads and so on and so forth. And we think that my grandfather belonged to the third of those categories, but we can never be sure. I think that the situation is always made more interesting by the fact that the Catholic Church looked upon itself as a monarchy. And it's very, very interesting when you look at pictures of popes of about 100 years ago or so, and you find that they have not only one crown but three crowns. And I believe monarchy speaks to monarchy, and that was one reason why, if there's going to be any conflict, it was going to be between the monarchy of the church and the monarchy of whoever else. It was certainly not going to be between the so-called ordinary people and any monarchy anywhere. Now, in recent times, of course, all that has changed, and you now see that I think a symbol of what the change has been is, strangely enough, a wristwatch. To me, that's always the symbol of the great change, because you now, instead of a pope being carried in the sedia gestatoria, you now have a pope going around, possibly in a pope mobile, but possibly in a Fiat or whatever it might be, and his arms in the air and his watch showing. Now, a pope wouldn't have had a wristwatch, of course, in the old days, but there was a symbol in a wristwatch that you were not depending upon people to tell you the time, and you didn't carry money because there were people who did that for you. So the church then moved to a democratic mode. Now, that did not mean it became a democracy. People used to always say, well, the church is not a democracy. I believe that the church should be the greatest democracy in the world, because it's the only party, and the only, I might say, political group that claims that its adherents are inspired by the Holy Spirit. Now, Fianna Fáil didn't do that, or the Unionist Party didn't do it, the Conservatives didn't do it, but we did. And therefore, because everybody is so inspired, then everybody should have something to say. And you cannot say to a person, look, you're inspired by the Holy Spirit at your confirmation, now shut up. That doesn't make sense. One is not complaining about that from a religious or theological point of view, but simply from the point of view of logic. So we had a problem then that anything that opposed monarchy was going to be under suspicion. And even when the occupation occurred in France during the Second World War, some of the bishops preached that this was understandable because they had made a terrible mistake in opposing the monarchy in the Great French Revolution. Now this seems almost unbelievable to us, but it is a fact. And therefore, the whole construction or the whole belief about what human society is about, with a monarch at the top and various hierarchical people below, that was very, very deep and still is. But the other thing that the Catholic Church taught, and still does, was that people have an obligation to support stable government. That is to say that the stable government may not be a good government. It may even be in many ways an unjust government. But there was still an obligation on people to support it because it was the one that had enabled people to live in a stable society and where there was law and order. So that these underlying notions, I think, had a great deal to do with our attitude to liberation theology. We had great heroes. Elder Camera was a great hero because he wrote things like The Spiral of Violence and showed that bad government leads to revolution, revolution leads to reprisal, reprisal leads to more atrocities. And all the insights that people had who were writing seemed to be very important. And therefore, people began to take heart, as I see it, people began to take heart that even with all the presumptions of church and state, nevertheless, there was now a current running within the church which said that the people have a wisdom which must out. And liberation theology, I must say, I was disappointed. Disappointed not because of the nature of it, but because some people were talking about it having a biblical foundation. But how far back do you go? Have we got an idea of liberation which tolerates the idea of my liberation occurring at the expense of someone else's? And I think that is something that people who talk about liberation theology or think about it have to consider. The other thing is that very many times, and certainly here, when people were talking about religion as a liberating thing, the formula, I think, is religion doesn't mean anything if it's not a liberation of people. But many people were oppressed, and they looked upon this fresh idea coming, as it were, from the bottom up. They looked upon this as a marvellous stimulation. But the number one problem is our liberation to be got at the expense of someone else's, which is a real political and moral problem. And secondly, are we going to use this whole concept and practice and philosophy and religious interpretation of liberation in order to solve the immediate problem that we may have? Dan Berrigan has lived his life with the problem of pacifism and war. Very much of his energy and time will be spent, sometimes in prison, very often demonstrating, but always thinking and praying and working. Now, people here would look upon the fact that, as we saw it, in the United States of America, very many religious people were combined with very many people who were acting politically in order to achieve freedom. And also the Jewish people, as we saw it in the United States, were able to count upon the moral support of the religious people within their own community. In Ireland, however, we had what Oliver has mentioned. we had this opposition between the church and the people who were trying to create real social change. So I think we had a number of problems, and I think that I would summarise those problems on those three headings. Question then, how do you resolve all this? Very often the resolution will come for some people by rejecting one thing or another. By rejecting, for example, the whole concept of excommunication, which is what many of the people here did. The other thing is by integrating certain things which seemed in the past to be impossible to integrate. For example, I remember very clearly being present at a meeting of people who were talking about what was happening in Nicaragua. And a film was shown which showed people praying, reciting a rosary. And they were really praying for the success and the welfare of the revolutionaries. Now, there was a little frisson of nervousness because this was a new idea for so many people. Can you really integrate this idea of prayerful help for the safety and welfare of your revolutionaries? But here in Belfast, it was a real question. It was a real problem. But obviously in Nicaragua, they had solved the problem. They simply prayed for them. The interesting thing is that years later, that became a reality. If you went up to the Bullring in Ballymurphy, you'd find people in a little tent out in the middle of the night praying the rosary. For whom? For the hunger strikers. So what was really happening with us, there was a tremendous amount of theoretical knowledge coming about how people abroad were dealing with all these questions and problems. Here, the inspiration was tremendous from the writers and the knowledge and that we were getting of what was happening abroad. But always, I believe, you had the limiting factors of not yet solving the problem. What happens if people tried to get their liberation by depriving others of liberation? And what happens when you try to integrate your desire for change politically with your desire for keeping your ideals? But there was a last one you want to mention. I'm sorry we're going on for so long, but this meant a lot to us. There was the question of liberation theology itself. If your liberation theology goes as far as solving your immediate problem, or your local problem, or your part of your problem, then once that problem is solved, what happens then? The creativity in liberation theology might be quite neglected. We've done the job. Our religion, our faith, or whatever has helped us. But there's a creativity in the whole idea of religion and faith and belief, liberating people, even if they're not in difficulties. It's a whole new way of life and a whole new way of looking at things. So I was just afraid that we perhaps had succeeded in quite without wanting to, we had succeeded in reducing the scope of that wonderful idea of religion, faith, belief, reality. Reality not curbing us, but liberating our minds. Yeah, that was it.
It seems to me that you have brought us to the heart of the issue in a way, and it is this: can a Christian engage in violence to achieve a political end? Now, if one says, that to be a Christian means to follow Christ and to be like Christ, and what is the example that Christ gives us? And indeed his very words that if someone hits you on one cheek, offer him the other, and so on and so forth. overcome evil with good. And so in circumstances of state oppression, is it legitimate, is it proper, is it right for Christians to engage in violence, even to rectify unjust structures? And I certainly remember that in the 1960s, with the civil rights movement and so on, the institutional church initially supported it. But then as things began to get violent in kind of 1968, there was a statement from the bishops to say that perhaps violence is becoming simply acceptable as a way of life. And even to achieve just ends, in other words, to bring about a fairer society in Northern Ireland, is it right that we should engage in violence? Now, of course, you could say that given how the church operates, given how the church is structured, there is a sense in which, in supporting the state, it will support state violence, if you like. So in other words, we appoint chaplains to armies and so on. And why do people join armies? To kill others, in defiance of the commandments and in defiance of the teaching of Christ. And yet the church is quite happy to appoint army chaplains and so on and so forth. Is it then, by analogy, is it correct then to say, well, for the church to administer the sacraments, let us say, to people engaged in guerrilla warfare, that's just doing the same thing, if you like, as the institutional church does when it's dealing with kind of regular armies and the state and so on and so on. But it seems to me that there is this more fundamental question of can I, on the basis of Christian faith, engage in violence? And this has been a problem for the church as long as Christianity has existed. In the first couple of centuries of the church, many Christians believed that, first of all, Christians should have nothing to do with the state at all. And secondly, to be a Christian meant that you could not be a soldier. And there are a number of instances, as I say, certainly in the second century, of people converting to Christianity and giving up, their role in the army and so on and so forth. The problem comes then when, in fact, the Roman Empire itself becomes Christian. And therefore the church has to set about re-evaluating its relationship with the state, and thereby beginning to appoint functionaries to assist the state, even in warfare. But it seems to me that this is a real issue. And again, sorry.
Well, no, sorry. No, it's very interesting because it is a real issue, and it's one that has to be faced, I think, with a great deal of courage. I remember here some years ago, the people invited two people to speak on that whole question of whether you could ever engage in a forceful demotion of a government. And the two people were a man called Verbeke. He was a Father Verbeke, who was not only a Catholic priest, but he actually was a member of the European Parliament. And the other man was Dan Berrigan. So Dan happened to be in Ireland at the time, so he hauled him along and said, well, come on and we'll talk with us. Now, Dan took the complete pacifist position, as we saw it then, that even if you were under attack, you did not respond. Now, for us, that was a problem, because what we were looking at was actually an attack on houses and homes and so on. So the question of your obligation, on the one hand, you had an obligation to defend your own family and your own people, and your own, well, let's say your own family. However, that was Dan's position, and everybody respected that. However, Verbeke's position was, no, that in face of violence or hardship or imposed upon people, you had to leave it to the people who were actually in that condition to make up their minds as to what they ought to do. And you had then not to judge the situation without reference to the decision, not just the condition of the people, but to the decision of the people who are actually in that state. That was one thing. The other thing was that in all the condemnations of violence, there was a distinct reluctance on the part of the people who were making these statements to define what violence actually was. Now, the trouble was that most people believed that we knew what violence was. We don't have to define it. And we don't have to define why it's wrong. Now, the same thing, I think, is happening with regard to two other things which are very painful. And one is the question of abortion and the question of abuse of children. That we have assumed that people know why exactly both of these things are wrong. So we're not taking the trouble to give, I believe, an ethical basis for what we're saying. So, in the case of violence, we made appeals again and again to people, please let us define what you mean. Is violence an unjust use of force? Some people said that's what it was. Well, who decides what is unjust? If you're talking about it being illegal, you really haven't got anywhere. However, so all these problems came up, and they were very deep in people's minds, and they weren't just academic questions. And I remember reading about how during the Second World War, the people who were fighting in the hills in France, what did you call them? The Maquis, was it?
Yes.
Yeah.
The resistance.
Resistance.
Yeah, and the resistance fighters. The principles of church and ethics as given by the Christians to each other in France was so strong, so deeply embedded, that these people came down from the hills and met in secret, of course, obviously, representatives or of the local bishop, wherever they happen to be, or the bishop, or the church authorities. And they asked for a solution to the question. Here they were up in the hills fighting away there, but they wanted to know what their moral position really was. And furthermore, they wanted, please, can you give us a priest? They were really asking for a chaplain. Now here was an interesting situation. They were refused, of course. So here was one set of people who were fighting for, as they saw, freedom. And they were refused the services of a priest. Others, who might not necessarily be fighting for freedom at all for anybody, were given chaplains. And all those things, that and many other things, these were the seeds of a terrible anger when the war was over. An anger which I believe John the 23rd was instrumental in soothing to an extent. But this was, the point I'm making is that deep down in our minds there are these ethical principles, and we need to elucidate them. We need to say exactly what they mean and exactly why it is that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. But definition was absolutely essential, and we very, very seldom got it. And I can tell the reason, when I believe I can. If you look at the definitions given, I think, by the United Nations of torture, you find that if you use that definition, you find that a number of governments are obviously coming under that definition. So governments don't like doing it. Now, the sad situation is that the people were not listened to when they said that torture was wrong. Now governments are able to say, yes, we do torture. President Obama said just yesterday, I think, that, yeah, torture was used. Yeah. You feel like the end of the sentence is, so what? So anyway, that's wandering from the point. But my point is that there are certain considerations, there are certain things which will not actually necessarily determine what people think about a concept like liberation theology, but will agonize them the people coming down from the hills, yeah, or the people sitting in Ballymurphy, and we all need help, and the only help is going to come from public discussion.
What's the place here of just war theory? Because surely just war theory is the church saying, yes, war can be legitimate, but it has to meet these criteria.
Yeah, the criteria, well, I'd give an example. I think maybe it's best to give an example of actual experience. That when these condemnations were coming of what, well, but let's be blunt about it, when the IRA was fighting, we knew that there was a Hungarian revolution in 1956, I think it was, and people stood in front of the tanks and so on and so forth. And there were plenty of people, church people, who said what wonderful people these were. They're leading this revolutionary thing against the Russians. We knew also that there was a tremendous, when I was growing up, there was a tremendous amount of Catholic support for the General Franco revolution.
Sure.
But when it came to an Irish revolution, then it was a different story. That it wasn't even on the merits of the case. It was on the principle of the illegitimacy of these revolutions. But we didn't always say that, and we didn't always make the same judgment about different revolutions. And there's obviously something wrong with the public discourse when that happens. So that has to be rectified. Now, the matter of principle, the experience that I had was that, and I'm being very personal about it, that we were officially, as a church, condemning violence, meaning the violence of one section, but not violence, because we didn't define it. Now, I was troubled by this, because he said there's one thing we must not do, and that is take church law or doctrine and make it do more than it can do. Don't exaggerate the meaning or the significance or the ethical power of your laws or your principles. So I went over and decided who was the most intellectually capable person that I had known among the clergy. And I went and talked to him. And he was there with another priest, and he said, I believe, he said, that and this was some of the mid to end 70s, that the conditions which are laid down, as Oliver talked about, I believe it can be well argued, and I believe it's true, that all of them have been fulfilled except one. I said, well, what's the one? He said, the one that says there must be a moral certainty, or rather, one would say a high probability, let's say, of success of what they're fighting for. And as time went on, of course, that possibility of success to some degree, the whole situation changed. But he said they think that's the one condition that's still lacking, and it could be argued. Well, I said that's not what we preached last Sunday. And his reply was, well, our business is to tell people what church policy is. And well, I said, well, perhaps we should end the conversation there. And his companion, he said exactly the same. I then went over to another side of the city, and I went to another person that I had a great regard for. The wonderful people, a priest. And I said, look, this is what I've done, this is what I've asked. Could you tell me what you've... He says, I have no problem with that. But I said, look, that's not what we said last Sunday. And he gave me exactly the same answer. So it really, the function of priest in that situation was to receive instructions and act accordingly. Any kind of, which seemed to me to be an unfortunate limitation on any inspiration or intellectual insights or spiritual insights that priest or anybody else might have. Now, how you solve that problem is an immense problem, of course.
Can I just intervene here, just to ask, because I know, Oliver, that you've taught at Hythrop College, so you're teaching priests. Are these big dilemmas for training priests, people who want to go into the church? Is this something they discuss?
Not particularly, I don't think. It's not a big issue. Certainly in the context of England or even I've taught in the States a bit in those circumstances. It would be an issue, obviously, as we've talked about in South America and so on. Although in general things have improved in South America, in the last 20 years and so on. But there is a point that I'd like to take up about what Des has been saying. I mean, I think it is true in the early 70s that institutional Catholicism did condemn some of the British government's policies. It condemned internment, for example, systematic raiding of houses and so on. And this caused great kind of perplexities on the part of the government. Diane knows about this. I've looked at some of the archival material on this in England. And so far as the British government was concerned, when the Irish hierarchy condemned various aspects of British government policy, they did so in such a way that they sounded like the complaints that the Republican movement was making. And so the government was inclined to tar the church along with the IRA, thinking that in fact it's simply articulating the same complaints that the IRA were articulating about internment and so on, about allegations of torture and so on and so forth. The institutional church was very much aware of this, and it did reflect this, and it did condemn those aspects of government policy which amounted to things like torture and so on. Its dilemma was this, that in complaining in the way that it did, it seemed to give encouragement to certain sections of the IRA. In other words, who could then say, well, we were right all along, and what's more, the church is saying this. And its great difficulty was that it would lose control over the Catholic community in the north of Ireland. And as time went on, it seemed that more and more Sinn Féin was becoming the authentic voice of the Catholic community and not the Catholic hierarchy. And after all, this is what the church has seen itself, historically, as the protector of people, the instrument by which the Catholic community articulates its own voice and so on. So far as the hierarchy was concerned, that was something that churchmen should do. And the difficulty then in the Troubles was that you would lay people, and violent lay people at this, who were willing to take the church on and say, no, we're perfectly capable of speaking for ourselves. And this is our analysis of the situation, and the institutional church is wrong. And this is something that bishops were very frightened about. Of that, there's no doubt. Losing control of a situation which was very, very complex, but a situation that, because of reasons of history, the church had time and again been able to contain. And the very fact that the British government doesn't give the credence and prestige to the church that it ought to have done meant that the church was not in a position really to act as an instrument for peace during most of the Troubles. And it seems to me this is partly to do with a failure of government policy, because at one point the government decides the church and the IRA are singing from the same hymn sheet. Yes.
Yes, certainly. This was the reality of the situation, and we used to think, it was the kind of situation that had arisen was like somebody who was, the parable of the man who was who was befriended on the roadside, who is my neighbour.
The Good Samaritan.
Yeah, the Good Samaritan. The person who is injured, who's lying down helpless, person who's in prison, who is being interned because of political beliefs or whatever it might be, helpless. When you go along and say, yes, I will help you, this is marvellous and it's beautiful. What happens when, after all you have done, the person stands up and says, thank you very much, now I can look after myself? And suddenly you realise that you may not have realised it, but you've lost control and you don't like it. And I think that's what was happening on a very large scale. And I think it's just a homely example of what Oliver was talking about. That it was very important. I mean, one could see a victim as a person to be helped, and one could see the same victim as an opponent very shortly after your help had actually achieved some measure of freedom for them. Mm-hmm. So all these things, looking back on it, seem like subtleties.
Yes,
but in fact they were realities
yes.
in life, and it explained an awful lot. It explained a lot, and I can say it quite clearly, because a man like Dennis Fall, who's a man of tremendous integrity and did wonderful work for people. We could never thank him for the work that he and Raymond and all the rest of them did for prisoners and for people who really needed help. But with all of us, there comes a time when we wonder whether the newly revitalised people are going to want something that we don't. And there you have the clash then of I think, of the structures and all the other things.
And it was partly to do also with the public perception of Catholicism, because of course the Church operates on a global scale, and whilst in the Irish context, we will understand why bishops or priests would condemn aspects of government policy, this wasn't as clear to people in other countries. And then particularly in England, where time and again English Church or ordinary English Catholics thought that bishops and priests were on the side of the IRA. And this is a thing that you got time and again in the years of the early troubles, and complaints from prominent English Catholics that Irish priests and Irish bishops supported the IRA, so much so that Cardinal Heenan, the Archbishop of Westminster, wrote to Conway asking Conway to draw up a statement or a book indicating the occasions since 1968, from 1968 to 74, whereby the Church had condemned the IRA. And this is what Conway did. He drew this up. I don't know if you ever got a copy of it, but he circulated it among all the kind of opinion formers in Britain and Ireland. At that time, all members of the cabinet got it, and various bishops and so on and so forth, just to try to counteract this perception, at least in England and indeed in other countries, that somehow the Irish Church was in the vanguard of revolutionary activity. It seemed absolutely extraordinary, because this was the allegation, that the Church didn't speak to condemn the men of violence. And it is true that at least the northern bishops, and again I got this from the papers of Cardinal Conway, having looked at his archives, the northern bishops did discuss at one point excommunicating people who were in fact members of the IRA. They decided not to do that because the whole ethos of excommunication and so on had completely changed. But then they discussed, should they make murder a reserved sin? And they decided that they would not do that because people simply wouldn't understand what a reserved sin was. This is kind of an idea that was very prominent previously, but now by this stage in the 1970s, no one had a clue, so they decided not to. But it is interesting and it is significant that they discussed the possibility of excommunication or of making murder a reserved sin. Precisely the things that prominent English Catholics said the bishops ought to be doing, excommunicating, people who were in the IRA.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting indication, though, of how little people will understand the actual power and abilities of church. I mean, a church in which the same penalty is given for murder as for making poaching. For both of them you could be excommunicated. So where was the power? There was a great misconception about how much power the church actually wielded. And there were lots and lots of people who were excommunicated. Some of the neighbours in my district were excommunicated, but they're as happy as Larry. They're not really terribly by it. But to us, the thing was just not happening.
Yes.
It was a matter of reality and principle. If a man or a woman up the street takes this view of excommunication, and if maybe somebody in high places changes the whole policy because of the fear of excommunication, there's something very strange happening somewhere. It's in other words, the weakest member of society had the most powerful remedy against excommunication. Didn't bother about it, like Jimmy Young. We never bore about them things. But the most powerful ones had the weakest response to excommunication. So what does excommunication mean?
And again, this is a very good point, because the perception was that if the priest told people to do something, they would do it. But as we know, this has never happened in Irish history. It is a history of the resistance on the part of ordinary people to excoriations, either from bishops or from priests. But this was the perception. And therefore, since the church was clearly not telling people to desist from violence, it was encouraging people in violence. This was the perception.
But it wasn't the perception here, though, was it? I mean, I think in Ireland wasn't the perception that the church was on the side of the British state and the Northern Ireland Assembly.
Yes, very much so.
Yes, there was, however, a very important thing that I think. Sorry, I hope I didn't interrupt you, but that there were very strong statements from church hierarchy with regard to a number of issues of importance, and of course the question of civil rights, the question of equality of opportunity and distribution of employment, a question of the control of the Mater Hospital, for example, in Belfast. All these, there were very strong statements made about a big firm called the Sirocco Works, which was all this thing. And very, very strong statements indeed came out from church hierarchy. Now, one of the interesting things about that was that, take an example of the Catholic hospital, the Mater Hospital, the very strong statements, but the politicians who were very much in favour of giving a fair deal to the Mater Hospital as they saw it, these people would say in Parliament, Stormont was at that time, we fully support the Mater Hospital's claim for grants. Unfortunately, we cannot comment on the actual state of the finances or whatever, because we have not that information. Now, this was a very humiliating situation, because there were people like a man called Simpson, people like that in Labour parties, who were willing to fight for the rights of the hospital in Parliament, but were not given the information necessary to make a proper case by the authorities, who were church authorities, because that was the way the hospital was. Now, we found then that this problem was really part of a whole parcel of problems, that the withholding of information about certain matters of education or welfare or whatever made it very difficult to get the cooperation of politicians, thus weakening the politicians, while at the same time people were asking that the political process should be strengthened. So we had a number of these, again, quite subtle problems if you look back at them now. But the question of who was going to make the decisions, the important thing was not sometimes what decisions would be made, but who will make them. And we used to make a joke of it by trying to turn the thing on its head by saying and all the discussion about liberation and all the rest of it, one principle that if you know you're looking for something that's very important to you, if you know that it's going to be granted by the people up the hill in the big hats on Friday, do your best to make it happen on Thursday to show who's boss. And I think that principle for us was very, very important, and it brightened many a dark day.
One further aspect is this, that from the point of view of the church's analysis, again, and I'm thinking of the early Troubles, it seemed to suggest that if the IRA could only appear as a legitimate organisation if it somehow managed to convince the Catholic population as a whole that its analysis was correct. And so often enough you've got churchmen saying that the IRA speak for no one but themselves. After all, they don't offer themselves at the ballot box to test their popularity and all this kind of stuff. And again, it's one of the things, the principles, as you mentioned, that for a war or a revolution to be just, it must have the support of the majority of the people in the country or in the society. But then when the IRA, through its political organisation, Sinn Féin, as it were, took the challenge of the church and did have the strategy of the Armalite on one hand and the ballot box on the other, the church changed its tune and said that a vote for anyone who votes for Sinn Féin is committing a serious sin. They didn't say mortal sin because we don't use those terms anymore, but any Catholic would realise that this is what they were saying. So it seemed a completely bizarre position for the church to take, to say, on the one hand, the IRA has no support. Why is it no support? Because it doesn't offer itself, for election. And then when it does, they try to say, oh no, but if you vote for Sinn Féin, that's a very wrong deed.
Yes, and they were actually saying that this is simply voting for violence in a different form.
Yes.
But a fascinating thing, that at the end of the 70s, there were quite a lot of people in the United States who were very sympathetic and wanting to be very helpful. And there was a lady I knew very well who was doing all kinds of things like attending demonstrations and so on. And she wrote to a publishing firm in Ireland and said that she would like to send them something she had written on the situation and try to make an analysis of the situation. Now this was somewhere at the end of the 70s, and the reply was, no thank you very much. And the director of the firm said, I totally disagree with what you have said and your analysis of the situation in Ireland. He was writing from Dublin. And he said, can you ever imagine, it was words like this, can you ever imagine a situation where Sinn Féin will get enough votes to make them into a significant party in Irish politics? And this was a director of Gillen McMillan. Now, and I thought to myself, well, if Gillen McMillan have this kind of idea, or this false analysis, this inability to have foresight and see what might happen in the future, then we're in a sorry pass indeed. Sure. But that was the attitude. But then, so the attitude that you find in the church, and we might find that you find the same attitude in the publishing houses or the broadcasting or whatever it might be. And it would be all and again, it was a terrible lack of public discussion about realities. And even today, you will get a discussion about gay marriage or about marches, but you will not get a discussion so easily about the basic morality or otherwise of, say, the capitalist system or any other system.
Well, we'll be discussing that after the break. So if we take a short break now, and we'll resume just after 3 o'clock. Thank you very much.